Welcome to Psychotherapy Networker Live. It's great to be here with you. My name is Anna Locke. I'm the clinical director at Networker, and I'm excited to be joined here today by Michael Mithoefer. Michael, welcome. Before we dive in, I'm going to give everyone a quick introduction to Dr. Mithoefer. In case you are not familiar with him, he's a psychiatrist and the senior medical director for medical affairs training and supervision at MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. He has played a really integral role in the development of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, really heavily involved in the research, and also very involved in training for additional therapists and researchers that are doing this important work. Michael, did I cover it?
I think you covered it pretty well, yeah.
Okay, those are the highlights.
What I've been doing for the last 23 years is MDMA-assisted therapy research, basically.
23 years. And I'm glad you brought that up, because we are very close to seeing movement for this becoming accessible to people in the United States. Is that accurate? We're making progress towards that?
We're making progress. We never know what the FDA is going to decide, but we just finished our second phase 2 trial. Have all the results analyzed. The company released the information that it was a successful trial. It confirmed the results of the first one, the first phase 3 trial, which we published in Nature Medicine. This was after 6 phase 2 trials. So we're on the home stretch, and later this year expect to be submitting a new drug application to FDA to apply for MDMA-assisted therapy to get an indication for PTSD. So we don't know the answer yet, but we're getting close to applying.
Wow, that's really exciting. Having just listened to one of the things that we'll talk about today is a new course that we have out with Michael, talking about the work that he does and about psychedelic-assisted therapy. There's the link right there. Please check it out. And I had the pleasure of watching this, and I really enjoyed listening to you talk about sort of the arc of development, particularly of MDMA therapy, but also the other psychedelic drugs, but just how far it has come and how powerful the indications are, the possibilities of how this can really, really be helpful. What I'm curious about is how you got involved in this.
Well, really, it was because of clinical need. I never actually set out to be a researcher. I was much more interested in being a clinician, but there I was practicing psychiatry. I practiced emergency medicine for 10 years, but then in 91, I went back and did my psychiatry residency and was practicing psychiatry. And as it happened, I was very interested in trauma. I was treating a lot of people with PTSD, and certainly we could help some of the people. And I was interested in different experiential therapies. I wasn't impressed by the pharmacology for PTSD. Sometimes it could be helpful, but clearly it was more about the therapy. And then over time, I realized, we had reason to believe that these psychedelics, MDMA and other psychedelics, could be useful to catalyze therapy, because there had been some research before it all got shut down. But and there were lots of anecdotal reports from when MDMA was used with therapy before it became illegal, but there was no controlled research about that done at that time. So it's just a matter of I'm seeing people who are suffering. I have reason our treatments are not adequate for a lot of them. I have reason to believe that, based on reputable reports, that these medicines could be useful. And I just felt this is not acceptable. No one's even researching this. We need to do better. So that's what it was, really the clinical need. But luckily, I didn't quite know what I was getting into at the time. So it's been an interesting ride, but that was what it was driven by, is really needing better treatments.
Wow. I feel so inspired by stories like yours, where I think as therapists and providers, we see the need it's there in so many different ways. And the like, well, what can we do about it? Something is not being adequately met. A need is not being adequately met. What can we do about it? And sometimes I can just feel so like defeated by what I perceive sometimes as my lack of ability to make a difference. And so to hear that you noticed this and did something about it, and 23 years later are still doing something about it, and that you're almost at that point of really having it be something that can be out there, just it's very inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's very discouraging and really heartbreaking when you're seeing a lot of people that you can't help adequately. So it's always, I've often said, I think we as therapists need better treatments just as much as our clients or patients do.
Yeah.
And this is not the only one, obviously. I think things like internal family systems therapy is another real step forward where suddenly people find something more effective. So this isn't the only one, but I think this is probably an important option.
Mm-hmm. That was something else I really enjoyed in the course as I was listening to you, which again, the post, the link for the new course that Michael has out with Psychotherapy Networker is up on the screen. Please check it out. One of the things I really enjoyed that you talked about was all the different therapies and modalities that can potentially be integrated with psychedelic assisted therapy, IFS being one of them. You talk about attachment. You even talk about CBT, just such a range of different therapies that this can be a nice integration with. And so I am kind of curious how much research is going on as far as that piece goes, like integrating the CBT, integrating the IFS. Is that happening already as well?
It's beginning to. I think that's a really interesting aspect of this. That people often say logically, how come you're not combining it with another specific established therapy? And I'll comment on that in a minute, but I will say now people are beginning to do that. We actually did a pilot study with couples with Candace Monson and Ann Wagner using cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy with MDMA. So, they had good data on that method. And so we're testing that. Barbara Rothbaum in Atlanta is studying MDMA with cognitive behavior, prolonged exposure therapy. So people are beginning to test that. That's great. And there's some people that want to do studies with IFS, internal family systems therapy, with or without MDMA. Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. I'm enthusiastic about seeing what they find. At the same time, one of the things I find most fascinating is when we take this relatively non-directive approach, or we often call it inner-directed approach, where we don't set out to do any specific kind of therapy, but we encourage the participant and the therapist to not have it, as much as possible, not have an agenda, and encourage people to just see what they discover. And then we work with what comes up. And I think what's so interesting about that is many of these elements of other therapies come up spontaneously, but at different times, in different orders, in different ratios for each person. Mm-hmm. So we did find that in active doses of MDMA, almost 80% of people end up talking about parts, right, and doing IFS kind of stuff. Whereas with the inactive doses, it's around less than 25%. So there's something about MDMA that seems to stimulate awareness of parts and more self-energy. Likewise, people end up doing prolonged exposure, imaginal exposure at some point, even though we don't tell them to. People mm-hmm. recognize their cognitive distortions, even though we don't set out to do cognitive behavioral therapy. People talk about the transference and psychodynamic stuff, and things come up in the body. All these different aspects of various different kinds of therapies seem to come in a kind of a unique combination for each person. And to me, that's very appealing, the idea of not getting ahead of the experience with an agenda and just see what you might discover, Because if you set out to do a certain kind of therapy, that can be useful, but you don't know what unexpected thing might come. Because so often we see somebody having an experience that we weren't expecting that turns out to be just so powerful for their healing.
That makes a lot of sense. You have to really be prepared to go any direction depending on what comes up for the person. And we get to see you do that in the course with an individual that you work with extensively, Nick, who is experiencing PTSD when he comes to you. What I liked about this in the course too is we didn't just see like a session. You know, sometimes we do like a session and we dissect it and we look at the nitty gritty of what goes on. But what we get to see here is more of the arc of the experience, including an interview with him at the end where he's able to kind of reflect on his experience. For those who are watching, again, we were joined by Michael Mithoefer, who's talking to us about MDMA assisted therapy and his new course with us on psychedelic assisted therapy. Could you tell us a little bit about what you share with us with Nick's treatment in the course?
Yeah, and I want to first really express my deep appreciation for Nick's willingness. You know, he's okay with us using his name and with me sharing these videos because he says, you know, he wants to give back, and especially to other veterans. He wants to contribute to helping us learn whatever we can about this. So really appreciate that. The way Nick allowed us to show some sort of the trajectory. And I think it was really fascinating, again, thinking about the value of not being too directive. We found out what Nick's progression was going to be, but we didn't know it ahead of time. In the prep sessions, you know, Nick had 2 tours as a turret gunner, a Marine in Iraq, and had a lot of combat trauma, a lot of symptoms. And in the preparatory sessions, he told us that the thing that bothered him the most was this rage that would come out. And then he'd yell at his wife. He was never physically violent, but then he'd feel terrible about it. But he couldn't help himself at the time. We're all familiar with that experience, I think. But he had a lot of that with the PTSD. And so in his first MDMA session, after about an hour and a half, he came out and first he told us about some feeling of anxiety he had coming up with the medicine coming on, how he breathed through that. But then the next thing that happened after he was inside, not talking for probably an hour, he told us he'd had this amazing experience of seeing he in the prep session, he told us that rage was like a monster erupting from his torso. He was trying to choke it, and it was stabbing him in the side. That was his experience. Wow. He told us ahead of time. In the MDMA session, he said suddenly he saw that part of himself, and he had it locked up in a jail cell. And he saw it have angry red eyes. It looked like a monster, but then he went to the door and he opened it. And he said, "I'm sorry I put you here. I understand why you're so angry because I've kept you locked up." And he said, "I think I saw that was the part of me that kept me and my buddies alive in Iraq. But I think I saw what it was capable of in Iraq, and I was so afraid of it, I kept it locked up." So he had this whole experience of hugging that part of himself and realizing it's an important part of me. I just don't want to be at war anymore, but I can use this energy. So it was just a beautiful resolution of that part. Then he went back inside, and an hour later he came out and told us about, sorry, my dog's waking up. He told us about when, he went over when his Humvee was blown up and his friend was killed, which he had talked about before. But in this session, he went through it really like in real time. It probably took him the same amount of time to tell us about it took to happen, really. It was, and he said, "I've never been able to see it so clearly before or feel what it was like so much before this." So it was after he made peace with that warrior aspect of himself then he was able to process the other war trauma in a different way. And so it had unfolded over a series of sessions where later he went on, he processed things about his childhood and being bullied and things that had to do with him going in the Marine Corps in the first place. You know, discovered all these different levels of his motivation. You know, part of it was because he wanted to do what he thought his country needed. But then there were all these other layers that he was able to discover, encounter, process. He processed a lot of moral injury about the people that he had killed. He did work with his wife, you know, processing how it was for them together to have these changes happening. So it was a very rich and varied experience that happened over a series of sessions. So it's a really good example of the depth and complexity of the experiences people can have. You know, it's as several people in our studies have said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy, making the point that, you know, it's not just that people get blissed out and everything's okay. Processing trauma is challenging and painful with or without MDMA. But so often the MDMA seems to help people suddenly, you know, not make it easy, but suddenly have a sense, okay, this is still hard, but I can do it now. I'm not going to be overwhelmed. And it seems to often allow them to process it in a way that they hadn't been able to. Because all the people in our studies, until the most recent study, but over the years, almost all the studies, it's been people who have already failed prior treatment for PTSD.
Right. Right. And so we really get to see the power of this work on so many different levels by watching your work with Nick. I'm watching the time. There were so many things I would love to talk to you about. I know a lot of people are curious about what they can do to get involved. You talk a little bit about training towards the end of the course. There was one piece that I think is really, really interesting that I do want to spend just a couple minutes on getting your take on. So I think in addition to trying to figure out as therapists, like how do we get trained? How can I prepare myself? There's also this question of like, how are people ever going to afford this? And it seems like to be able to pay for some of this work, it could be pretty expensive. How do you foresee accessibility to this treatment playing out for everyone?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because it's a very important issue that we've been grappling with for quite a few years now. Because you know, MAPS is a nonprofit. MAPS Public Benefit is a public benefit corporation owned by MAPS. So you know, this is not geared toward maximizing profit like many drug development things. So we're, you know, there are two parts of that. One is we realized early on in our phase 2 trials that we were trying to recruit a more diverse population and we just weren't very successful. And we realized pretty early on it was because we didn't have a diverse enough group of therapists. So, you know, people of color or people from marginalized communities had trouble trusting that this would be okay to do, understandably. Sure. So over the years, we've made quite a lot of progress in that. We've had, you know, a lot more therapists trained working on the clinical trials from different sexual identities and people of color. And in fact, between our biggest successes now, we just finished our second phase 3 trial, and more than half of the people that were enrolled were from marginalized communities, people of color. And
that's a big difference from the beginning, huh?
So that was way different. So we've made good progress, and we need to keep working on that. The other part is how can anybody pay for it? You know, and there's been, you know, for a number of years now, there have been parts of the organization working on getting insurance codes. So insurance companies and Medicare and Medicaid would hopefully pay for it. Again, this is all speculative because it hasn't been approved yet, but we need to start, obviously we've been working on it. So there's that part, try to get insurance and Medicare and Medicaid coverage. There's the company wants to have a patient assistance program to help people, the challenge being that, the drug isn't going to be the biggest expense. It's all the therapy.
Right.
So concentrated up front. There are two papers from Elliot Marseille, who's a healthcare economist from the University of San Francisco, who's analyzed our data, and he's determined it's very cost effective over several years, but it's more expensive up front. So part of it's helping people, insurance companies and government agencies realize it's going to save them money in the long run. But then the other part is trying to work on making it less expensive, because we have very high level of support with 2 therapists and lots of 8-hour sessions and all that, which I think is very important for some people, but other people might not need as much support. We got to be very careful with that, because it's not trivial. People can things can get stirred up. People can get suicidal if they're not supported, just like any deep therapy. But we're about to start a group therapy study. So that's one avenue to discover more about how can we have economies that way, by group therapy for people that would be suitable for. So those are the 2 prongs, trying to figure out, or 3 prongs, making sure we have a diverse population that this is available to, making sure we get it paid for by anybody that has any kind of payment, and then figuring out a way to support people that don't have insurance, and ways to make it as cost effective as possible. It'll be a lot easier to sort that all out if we get approval, when it gets easier to study everything when you're not in a Schedule I drug situation.
Right. Well, it's really hopeful to hear that those are things that are already being considered, that there's thought going into it. So hopefully, we can hit the ground running with helping people have access in those ways and feel safe having access to them just as soon as possible. We are out of time. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Again, I feel like I've spent a lot of time with you lately because I've watched your course. It's nice to have some time to talk to you one-on-one. Again, for those in the audience, please check out Michael's course. You will enjoy it as much as I have, I'm sure of it. And also, so we have that link here. We also have a link for our magazine subscription, a deal for $12 for the whole year for the magazine, where you can go back and read previous issues where we have talked about psychedelic work and about trauma. There's lots of different kind of insights and resources that you can find in our magazine that I think y'all would really enjoy. So please check that out as well. And Michael, I look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Anna. Good to talk to you.
Good. Thank you.